So we are doing our third session on the subject of creation, and this will be the last one. But I wanted to just do kind of a follow-up on what we've been talking about. You know, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and you know, it's part of, if we believe in God, I don't think we have too much of a problem to believe that that's true, that in the beginning God did create everything. But of course that stands in opposition to the theory of evolution, and we were talking about that as well. And I want to continue to look at that issue because, you know, it sort of implies that there's a problem between science and the Bible. You know, you either are a scientist or you are a theologian, and the two don't mix. But I tried to, you know, disprove that the last time. We were talking about all the great Christian scientists that have, you know, existed, the men of God who have become very great scientists. And so really Christianity has contributed a lot to our understanding of the world from a scientific viewpoint. And I want to go through a list of some reasons why, from a scientific standpoint, I do not believe the theory of evolution is possible, and that I believe that the Bible worldview, the biblical worldview, is much more supported by science. You know, the Bible, according to the Bible, it was a young earth, and also there was this cataclysmic event, namely the Noahic flood. And that a lot of what we see in science today points towards this cataclysmic event rather than just, you know, slowly building up layers and layers and layers. So this is what we want to look at today. But I want to use an example of, this is kind of like an analogy, but it's a very interesting analogy because, you know, we knew it took a while for people to realize that the earth wasn't flat. And, you know, by the time you got to the 1500s, people were, you know, pretty much sold on the idea that the earth is a globe, you know, that it's round, floating around, and, you know, the sun is the center of the solar system. But it took these, you know, these great Christian men to discover that. But as I said, by the 1500s, that was pretty well accepted to the point where a guy named Magellan was willing to get into a boat and head, I think he was heading east, and with the idea that if he just kept going, eventually he'd get back to where he started. And sure enough, that's what happened. He was the first person to circumnavigate the earth. And I guess by the time he did that, we've pretty much proven that the earth is not flat. But here's the crazy thing. There are people today who still insist that the earth is flat. In spite of, you can look it up online, it's the Flat Earth Society or something like that, and they've got all this pseudoscience that goes with it. You know, like the moon is only 31 miles in diameter, and the sun is only 3,400 feet above the earth. I mean, just all of this nonsense, which is totally debunked by science. But why am I talking about that? Because I think it's an example of people who want something to be true, and, or maybe a better way to say it is that what they believe supersedes science. You know, it overrides science. And I think we could come up with a million examples of that. But I think it relates to this subject of evolution because I think an evolutionist is really kind of doing the same thing. They cherry pick the information that seems to fit their worldview, and they ignore a lot of stuff that doesn't. So here's a list of 4 things, and this list could go on way beyond 4 things, but 4 things that I'm thinking about that make me believe the theory of evolution is basically not possible. 1, strata. You know when you look at the Grand Canyon, and I've got some great pictures here that I will show you of the Grand Canyon, and you have all those layers of rocks. Someday I got to go there. I wish I could say I took these pictures, but I got them offline. But I mean, it's a great example of how an evolutionist sees the world. And he sees all these layers. So I did some math, and the Grand Canyon at its deepest part is something like 4,265 feet. All right. So let's do a little bit of math here now. If it's that deep, that would translate to something like 51,180 inches. Now the evolutionist will say that the Grand Canyon is 5 million years old. So now what you have to do is divide 5 million into 51,180 inches, and you come up with a number of 0.01236, which is basically a little teeny tiny fraction of an inch. And you would have to assume, if the Grand Canyon has been there for 5 million years and all these layers would have to represent, 5 million years, that means that's only going to be a tiny fraction of an inch for each of those years. So, what's the problem with that? Well, one problem is that if you look at those layers, you're going to see that they're pretty much totally flat. I mean, flat as a pancake. So wouldn't you have to assume that the Earth for most of those 5 million years was like totally flat? There were no rivers, there was no erosion, I mean, this is really what those strata are saying, if indeed they are that old. Plus the fact that these same strata, these layers that you see, can be found all across the United States and even as far away as Europe. So, something isn't adding up there, at least in my mind. And then you have these other strange phenomena. One thing is the dinosaur bones. Now we know dinosaur bones have been buried, and they had to be buried quickly because a dinosaur sitting there for all these years at a fraction of an inch a year obviously would not still be there. After a few years he would have disappeared. So he had to be buried immediately. And some of these dinosaur graveyards are very, very deep. Another problem that comes into play is something called, what is it called? It is called a polystrate tree. I'm not sure if I pronounced that right. Well, basically, you've got these trees that are embedded in these layers of sediment. And, I've got, you can actually go online and find pictures of them in some of those websites. I wasn't sure if they were copywritten, so I drew a picture. I went to my graphic art people, which was basically me and a pencil, and drew a picture of what they kind of look like. But it's basically a tree that's standing upright, and the funny thing about it is that some of those trees are actually upside down, some of those fossilized trees. And the other problem is that if you do a carbon-14 dating on the tree and then the sediment, the rock that it's within, there are discrepancies there too. So how do we explain this? I mean, how does that add up? And I actually was listening to an evolutionist explain this. He said, yeah, well, these creationists, and they've got these, this thing about these trees. Well, I can explain how that could happen. So he gets into this scenario where the tree was sitting there growing, and then one year there was a huge flood. And that flood deposited like 12 inches of mud around the bottom of the tree. Well, the tree keeps growing, and the next year the same thing happens, and it just keeps building up that way. I'm not sure where you would find a situation like that. And by the way, there are hundreds and hundreds of these trees. There's a place in Nova Scotia where it's like a whole forest of these petrified trees that are sitting upright. So, how do you explain that? Well, this is how he explained it. Now, this brings up another problem and another issue, because now he's saying that, well, there could be a layer of up to 12 inches that represents 1 year. Now, if that's true, what is that going to do to your average, that little teeny tiny fraction of an inch that, if you're looking at the Grand Canyon, it kind of messes up your formula there, because then there would have to be other times, and he even said this, well, of course, there have to be times when only 1 inch would represent 10,000 years. Well, I mean, maybe, but to me, this whole argument is not making sense. It's kind of falling apart. The other thing is, when you look at those strata, you're going to see that for the most part they're horizontally, very flat. But every once in a while, and I got another picture I can show you. This is just like a little example in a rock that I saw as I was walking through the woods. But you can see the layers are sort of straight, but then you get these curves in them. And there are much better examples of that in the Grand Canyon, where all of a sudden the strata is not straight anymore, but it's got these huge bends in it. So how does that happen? Well, I can tell you one thing. If those strata were laid down, evenly, and then somehow bent, maybe, pressure pushing against them, I will guarantee, as a contractor who's worked a lot with cement and rocks, that if you put pressure on a rock, it will not bend, it will break into pieces. So this is just, maybe, I'm not a scientist, but I'm just saying, this is what I'm seeing. So at one point, all of these layers had to be flexible enough, and this would be very compatible with the idea of a world flood, a catastrophic flood, to be all of a sudden pushed up in different areas to make these nonconformities. So anyway, those are some things about strata. I mean, there's other things that you can get into. But another issue that we come, number two, I guess I would say, is the fact that they are now finding soft tissue within dinosaur bones. And this is something that they're pulling out of something that's supposed to be millions and millions of years old. In fact, a T-Rex is one example. And they're pulling out of these bones little bits of soft tissue. Now that's very significant, because if they're millions of years old, there would be no soft tissue. But they're pulling out little bits of red blood vessels and collagen and cartilage and proteins. I mean, things that just would not last millions of years. And I think it's interesting too, and maybe this is something about the nature of the evolutionist, but rather than admit, yeah, well, these dinosaurs couldn't possibly be that old, they're now trying to invent something that they call preservation mechanisms. So they're trying to invent some way, some theory as to how this soft tissue could have lasted for so long. So, I mean, that's another example that I think throws a wrench into the evolutionary scenario. Another thing that I find interesting is when you start talking about something like a coal seam. Well, first of all, if you look at the fossil records, obviously the oldest animals would have to be on the bottom, and the newer animals, going up to the top. But that doesn't always work. In fact, some of these layers are inverted. So, how do you explain that? That's a whole nother issue. But let's talk about coal. Coal, according to the evolutionists, was formed, again, millions of years ago. And it was vegetation, organic matter that just sort of accumulated, and then it got buried, and the pressure sort of squished it all together and it turned into coal. So one of the problems with that is that if you look at coal from a microscopic standpoint, you find out that it's primarily made up of tree bark. Tree bark without the tree and without any other types of organisms. How do you explain that if your scenario is that it was, like trees and, swamp and plants and all kinds of animals and things all kind of gooing together. But in reality, the coal is made up primarily of tree bark. So you got to come up with some other kind of explanation, which actually lends itself very well to this idea of a cataclysmic event. And the other thing about coal that I find really interesting is that occasionally people will find artifacts, human artifacts, in the seams of coal. And it's interesting, you get these stories down in Pennsylvania, down in the coal mines, all the things that people have found. Things like, there was one case where they found a little brass bell. Once they found an iron mask, like they used to make those death masks and pour iron in it. And so that was in a seam of coal. They found shoe prints, actual shoes, prints within coal. They found pieces of slate that had writing on it, that had pictures on it. And the other thing about coal is that it's found in association with layers of marine fossils. How does this happen? The coal is definitely not a marine substance. It's plants, earthbound plants and animals that are all kind of melding together. And what are they doing buried under layers of marine fossils? So, these things are kind of head scratchers. And again, I actually heard somebody on the evolutionary side say, in regards to those artifacts found in coal, this is amazing. This proves that life must be, millions of years old instead of just thousands of years old. Instead of saying, no, the coal isn't that old. And I also heard somebody that had done some research on, on these matters of fossilization, who in a laboratory was able to duplicate, once they figured out the elements that were within coal, the organic matter plus some certain chemicals or certain minerals, I think it was. Once they got the right combination, they were able actually to make coal in the lab. And guess how long it took? Well, it took a while longer. They could make fossils in 24 hours, but the coal took 3 weeks. So, all of this evidence is just something that will be totally ignored by your typical evolutionist. Finally, there's been this concerted effort amongst evolutionists to convince themselves that they're right and to invent things that just aren't true. We would call that a hoax. One example would be, Lucy is a good example of that. Remember, I don't know if you read in your science books, they might still be telling you that Lucy was, a missing link, but she wasn't. It was just the skeleton of an ape that was found in Ethiopia, and it got sort of turned into this evolutionary hero. But the bottom line was they proved that it was nothing to do with a missing link, but it was just an ape. Another example is something called the Piltdown Man. And this was found in a town in England, and late 1800s, I'm thinking, but they pieced together what they thought was a missing link because it had the cranium of a human and the jaw that looked a lot more like an ape. So they, pat themselves on the back and said, we found the missing link. In fact, it's kind of sad, but the Piltdown Man was one of the evidences that Clarence Darrow used to, quote, prove evolution. Remember, that was the Scopes trial that we talked about, and unfortunately his proof turned out to be nothing more than a hoax, where once they examined this supposed skull, they found out that it wasn't from the same creature. It was a human skull, but it was also the jawbone of an ape. And that's not the only time that that's been done. More recently, something called the Archaeoraptor. And this was supposed to be proof that dinosaurs evolved into birds. And this was a really big deal because everybody was so excited because they've been able to prove that as a kind of another one of those missing links. Well, it turns out that what they were dealing with was 3 different fossils. And there was a fossil that included a dinosaur tail, and there was another fossil that was the fossil of a bird, and they just sort of conveniently stuck them together and insisted they were from the same animal. Of course, they weren't. All you had was the tail of a dinosaur and the skeleton of a bird. So, but they pushed it as being absolute true, and of course it was discredited. And you could go on and find a lot of examples like that of hoaxes that is kind of this wishful thinking on behalf of evolutionists that, man, I wish this was true, but in reality it's not. And I think it is interesting that Darwin himself admitted that one of the problems with his theory was that there simply weren't any missing links that they could point to. And the other interesting thing about Darwin was he also said that if life is more complex than the cells that we could see. And you have to remember, back in his day, they did have microscopes. Remember, we talked about Leeuwarden, who was the guy, no, Leeuwenhoek. Leeuwarden is a town. Leeuwenhoek is the scientist who invented the microscope. And he was able to see all these tiny things that nobody saw any before. So from Darwin's perspective, he had access to that kind of information, but the smallest thing he could see was a cell. And he said if the cell is composed of things that are more intricate than just that one cell, the theory of evolution is much less likely to be true. And so this is kind of where you end up. And why I think the Bible, remember we read that verse in Romans 1:22, the fool has said in his heart there is no God. This is the biblical take on somebody that kind of goes in that direction. And I think, from the scientific standpoint, in some ways, they are making themselves look to be fools. We don't have all the answers. I'm not claiming that there still aren't some questions and some head scratchers out there, but I think overall, the scientific evidence is pointing in favor of the biblical worldview. So where do we end this? I think it's important to talk about this, and because as we talked about how this theory of evolution has implications for the things we believe on the spiritual realm as well. The Bible says, it makes it very clear that God created the heavens and the earth, and the very first thing he said was, it is good, and that there wasn't anything wrong. It was a perfect earth. It was Eden. And then we'll be getting into this whole issue of sin and the fall of man and all of that stuff. But theory of evolution kind of puts a kink in that theory, because that would mean there was death before man was even created, and that's why I think we really need to take this seriously, do some serious thinking about this. So where do we end? Well, next time we'll put the subject of creation behind us now and look forward to Genesis chapter 2. So that can be your homework for the next time. And it gets into, who we are as God creates man and woman. Who are we? And, what was it that God commissioned us to do? So we'll get into those questions, and that can be your homework. But I want to leave you with a good word. And I want to incorporate the idea of creation in our scripture as we leave us with this benediction. And I want to read a verse from Psalm 51. I've got two verses. And they both use the word create or created, or create or creation. And the first one is found in Psalm 51:10. This is a psalm that David wrote. David was a poet, and many of the Psalms, that book of Psalms, which is kind of right in the middle of the Bible, he wrote a lot of those Psalms. And he wrote this 51st Psalm, Psalm 51, at a certain time in his life when he had done something very wrong. Now he was a godly man. He was, the Bible calls him a man after God's heart, but he did get into some trouble, and some of you might have heard the story of David and Bathsheba and how he had her husband killed, and it just wasn't a good thing, and he felt so guilty that he wrote this psalm, which was really a psalm of repentance. And this is his prayer in this psalm, and he says, "Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a steadfast spirit within me." And that's a wonderful thing to think about. The God who created the world is also able to create within us a new heart. And then one other verse that has that same word is found in 2 Corinthians 5:17. If anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. Old things have passed away. Behold, all things have become new. And I think when we think about creation, it's important to understand that all these things we see around us were created by God. But it's also important for us to understand that that God who created all those things also created us. And he wants us to know Him, not just to know about Him. And He has made it possible for us to have a renewal in our own being, in our own spirits and hearts, that He can create in us a new, clean heart. I think that's a wonderful thing to know. And probably more important to know that than to even know all the details about how God created the earth. So this is where we're going to end today. And I want you to remember that I'm thinking of you guys, and I hope you can join us next time as we look at Genesis chapter 2. And join us next time on Gen Z Bible class. Bye-bye.